At 7:42 on the morning of May 27, 1940, a British captain named John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill, universally known to his men as Jack Churchill, crouched low behind a broken stone wall on the edge of a shattered French village. The town name would be written differently in later reports. The mist and the confusion braided the language as surely as the barbed wire braided the countryside. For Jack, the names mattered less than the world pressing in around him. Collapsing lines, retreating units, the constant rattle of mechanized war. 5 German infantrymen moved forward through the whitening field smoke and morning mist, the crackle of their boots the only rhythm for miles. They moved carefully, an NCO at their head, eyes scanning hedgerows, checking windows alert for ambush. They were well trained. They did not expect the past. He was 33 years old, 14 years past Sandhurst. He had trained with the old forms. He had spent a decade in the Empire and years at sport and the strange wanderings of a restless man. He had 0 confirmed kills in combat, until that moment. In his hands, he did not carry a rifle or a Tommy gun. Instead, he bore a 6-foot English longbow, heavy and patient. A 70-pound draw that had once split targets at 200 yards for sport and pride, not for murder. He had represented Great Britain at the World Archery Championships in Oslo 11 months earlier. He had finished midfield, nowhere near champion, but precise enough to pierce the silence at distance and carry death in a way bullets could not. He had practiced until his fingers found the same anchor point without thought, until muscle remembered what mind might forget. The German patrol drew within 30 yards. The sergeant in front performed the routine of modern war. Clear the hedgerows, check windows, search for the predictable threats, rifles, light machine guns, grenades. He did not scan for the impossible. Jack drew, anchored, and released. The arrow flew like a faint, arrogant whisper and struck the sergeant in his chest. He collapsed without a cry. It was the first confirmed longbow kill in a European war since the 17th century. It would be the last confirmed longbow kill of the Second World War. A man who the doctrine manuals, the war offices, and the modern tacticians had smiled at and labeled eccentric had just proved something old and ugly. That sometimes in war, the rules of probability break and a single, precise act rewrites the legend. Setting the stage, why this mattered, to understand the full weight of that arrow, we must understand the moment into which it was fired. In the spring of 1940, Europe was convulsing. The Wehrmacht had overrun Poland in 36 days. Their armored columns moved with a mechanical confidence across the flatlands of Western Europe. Their panzers and air support made armies look clumsy and wooden. France was falling at speeds that stunned staff officers in London. Shepherded by blitzkrieg, the German war machine made the old rules obsolete. The British Expeditionary Force, until recently the pride of professional soldiers, found itself retreating under a relentless hammer. Roads bled men and material toward the Channel ports. Vehicles, guns, and stores were abandoned in heaps on the roadside. Officers burned sensitive documents. Men threw away boots and rifles to run faster, and entire formations disintegrated into small, frightened bands seeking the sea. Between May 26th and June 4th, 1940, 338,000 British and Allied troops were evacuated from Dunkirk. They came home alive, but they came home without their weapons and with a new, bitter understanding of what defeat felt like. Jack Churchill did not leave empty-handed. He kept his bow, he kept his sword, he kept his bagpipes, and over the next months he would prove those things mattered in a war obsessed with modern instruments of destruction. Who was Jack Churchill? His life before war read like an adventure manual. Jack Churchill was not merely a soldier. He was a personality carved against the weirdness of the era. A Sandhurst graduate from 1926, he served with the Manchester Regiment in Burma, then walked away from the army in 1936 because peacetime soldiering bored him. He worked as a newspaper editor in Nairobi. He performed as an archer and a bagpipe player in films, a small part in The Thief of Baghdad. He rode motorcycles across Burma and India, once smashing into a water buffalo. He escaped the tedium of stationary life by living large and precariously. When Britain declared war in September 1939, Churchill rejoined his regiment, but he did so on his own terms. He brought 3 things that made him a curiosity and then, to those who saw it, an asset: a longbow, a Scottish broadsword, a basket-hilted claymore, and Highland bagpipes he had taught himself to play across the years. To many officers he seemed eccentric. To some he seemed unstable. The War Office had no doctrine for men who wished to carry medieval weapons into modern combat. Regulations simply did not anticipate this. But Churchill had read more than regulation. He had read history. He knew the mathematics of conflict. Modern rifles had range and volume, and the machine gun choked a battlefield with lead. A submachine gun could fire more than 10 rounds in one hand than a longbow might in the same minute. And yet, he argued, there were moments when the old ways offered advantages bullets could not buy. He understood that warfare is not only applied physics. It is psychology. In the chaos of close fighting, in ambushes and hand-to-hand clash, the mind can freeze. A man advancing with a sword raised and a war cry ripped up through him is not a man in a firing stance. He is an idea. He is something that the training does not prepare you for. And an arrow through the heart, fired from silent cover, removes the chance to respond. Dunkirk. Leaving and arriving. During the Dunkirk evacuation, the BEF fractured, fell back, and mostly survived. For many soldiers, the experience was humiliation wrapped in survival. For Jack Churchill, Dunkirk was a proving ground. He covered the retreat of his company. He killed enemy soldiers with weapons that belonged in a museum, and he arrived back in Britain with his medieval tools intact. He did not return to civilian life with shame. He returned with the certainty that he had a role. Almost immediately, he volunteered for the new units being formed in secret by the War Office, the Commandos. Born from desperation in mid-1940, from a Britain that stood alone and was being shelled with the constant threat of invasion, the Commandos were small, elite, ruthless raiders trained to throw themselves into the jaws of enemy coastlines, destroy what they could, gather intelligence, and vanish. The training was brutal. The Commandos trained in Scotland in the mountains around Archery. They marched 30 miles a day with full kit. They practiced amphibious landings in freezing water. They learned the art of killing silently, knives, garrotes, bare hands. Live ammunition was fired over their heads, and mistakes meant returning home in disgrace. Volunteers only, and Churchill volunteered. He joined No. 3 Commando and threw himself into training. Older than most volunteers, he outtrained them. Longer marches, steadier aim, harder fighting. He tested everything the Commandos demanded, and he added his own strange talents. He could place an arrow at 200 yards. He could play bagpipes while charging. He could handle a broadsword with the skill born of long practice. At first, his comrades did not know what to make of him. Some thought he showed off. Others thought him mad. But when an idea is more effective than mockery, mockery stops. Operation Veggie, Operation Archery. By November 1941, Combined Operations Headquarters ordered a major commando assault on the German garrison in the town of Vagsøy, off the Norwegian coast. The island controlled access to a network of fjords that ferried iron ore from neutral Sweden, a supply route the Germans prized. The island garrison numbered around 150 soldiers with 4 coastal guns and an anti-aircraft battery. The town's fish oil factories turned glycerin for explosives. The plan called for surprise. Dawn landings across multiple beaches, bombardment from cruisers, RAF strikes overhead. Jack requested to lead the first wave onto Moy Island. He requested permission to carry his broadsword and to play his bagpipes as he advanced. Some senior officers questioned his sanity. The Commandos, more practical people who had seen what worked, granted the permissions. Sometimes in war, rules are adjusted to fit talent. On Christmas Day, 1941, under Arctic darkness, the Commandos sailed north. Ice rimed the rails. The men huddled, writing letters, checking weapons. 105 Commandos were under Churchill's direct command. Their objective was clear and brutal: neutralize the planned defensive batteries within 10 minutes of landing or risk annihilation. At 8:48 on December 27, 1941, the ramp hit rock. Churchill stepped into the freezing surf and raised the bagpipes. Against the drumming of shells and the thunder of the cruiser HMS Kenya, he played the march of the Cameron men. The sound cut across the gunfire like a knife. The Germans were trained to fight men with rifles and grenades. They were not trained to fight a man playing music as he walked into their guns. The psychological, impossible to predict, immediate and decisive. Churchill lobbed a grenade. He set down the pipes, drew his broadsword and charged. With him went the Commandos, Thompson drums choking and rifles barking. The assault was violent, ordered, and shockingly quick. Bunkers were cleared, guns destroyed with charges, the anti-aircraft battery overrun. The garrison surrendered or was killed. The raid took fewer than 10 minutes for the initial objective. South Vagsoy, the town opposite the island, fought harder. By afternoon, the Commandos had cleared the streets, destroyed factories, seized documents and codebooks, and taken over 100 prisoners. Their success was purchased in blood. 17 British dead, 53 wounded. Churchill emerged without a scratch, his sword bloody and his bagpipes intact. He had become, in public imagination and in military legend, the officer who charged with a claymore while pipes screamed into the Arctic wind. The raid was significant. Hitler ordered additional troops sent to garrison Norway. Tens of thousands of soldiers were diverted from other fronts. A raid of 300 commandos had tied down an entire army in defensive posture. The effect of small units on strategic allocation of forces is often overlooked by the High Command. Operation Archery forced the Germans to reconsider deployments and validated the use of aggressive raiding tactics. Raid aftermath, reputation grows, newspapers amplified what the Commandos did. But more importantly, the military did not ignore it. Reports of the man with the sword and the pipes filtered back through the chain of command. Posters, dispatches, and rumors stitched together a persona that commanders began requesting for operations. The War Office, which had once viewed his medieval accoutrements with suspicion, now had to accept that unorthodox equipment could be militarily effective in certain hands. Promoted to command positions, Churchill's next actions would follow him across the pages of his own legend. Sicily, Operation Husky. The Allied invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky, launched on July 9, 1943, was the largest amphibious operation of its time. It was a turning point that would pry the back of the Axis Mediterranean position. British, American, and Canadian troops landed in waves. No. 2 Commando landed on the eastern coast at Catan and other codenamed beaches under the leadership of Lieutenant Colonel Jack Churchill. He carried the full panoply of his identity led into war: broadsword at the waist, longbow across his back, pipes ready. The fighting in Sicily became a grinding, attritional campaign. Parachute troops, panzer counterattacks, fortified villages and ambushes slowed the Allied advance. Jack led his men through mountain passes, flanked supply lines, and gathered intelligence. He struck at railway and convoy, at the tiny weaknesses in the German position when the High Command looked at the broad map and failed to see the micro-opportunities. By September, the island fell, and Allied eyes turned toward the Italian mainland. The next major challenge would be the Salerno landings, Cerno, codenamed for the assault south of Naples. Intelligence suggested that opposition would be light. It was not. The Germans had reinforced, and the landing became a desperately contested fight. At Vitry-sur-Mer, Churchill's commandos defended a critical road and rail junction that looked down onto the Bay of Salerno. Without that ground, naval gunfire could be aimed directly at the beaches and the landing force could be destroyed. For 5 days, Churchill and his men held their positions against repeated German counterattacks. They fought from ruined buildings, from ditches, from rubble, improvised fortresses in a terrain of total destruction. They called in naval artillery to break stubborn positions and refused to yield even as ammunition and rations dwindled. During this period, on the night of September 14th, a German observation post on a hill above Molina directed fire that imperiled the beachhead below. A frontal assault would be suicide, machine guns, mortars, interlocking defense. So Jack selected a single corporal and slipped into the dark. 2 men could move where 200 could not. 2 men could capture what 200 would bleed for. They crawled through drainage ditches and along stone walls, avoiding the obvious tracks. At the first post, they saw the orange tips of cigarettes. Men relaxed, not expecting stealth that moved like a ghost. Jack stepped out of the night with broadsword in hand. The Germans, stunned by the apparition of a man out of an earlier century, surrendered. He used his revolver lanyard as an improvised lead rope and marched prisoners to the next position. By dawn, he had taken 42 prisoners, including an entire mortar crew, without firing more than a pistol shot and without wasting a life that his captives thought they had to lose. It was, as he later said, a scene from the Napoleonic Wars. He received the Distinguished Service Order for the action. The citation praised his courage, leadership, and initiative, hardly mentioning the antiquity of the weapon that made the action theatrically unforgettable. Italy, the long grind. The Salerno beachhead secured by September 20th. The Allies pushed north. Churchill and his commandos stayed ahead of the main force, raiding supply points, capturing enemy personnel, and disrupting lines of communication. His reputation crossed not only British lines but German ones as well. Soldiers in the Wehrmacht whispered tales about the mad British officer, the man who played bagpipes on the cliffs, who charged with a claymore, who captured garrisons with the patience of a hunter. The war in Italy bogged down into the slow, lethal attrition of hill fighting. The Gustav Line, with its fortified ridges and rock-fist defenses, turned every advance into an ordeal. In the spring of 1944, Churchill was transferred to a wholly different theater, Yugoslavia, to support partisan forces under Josip Broz Tito in guerrilla campaigns along the Dalmatian coast. The terrain was brutal, the German presence determined and often brutal. On the Adriatic Islands and mountainous hinterlands, the Commandos operated with local partisans, mixing disciplined, trained units with irregulars who knew the ground. By the spring of 1944, combined operations placed Churchill and his battalion on island operations and raids. Early attacks scored tactical victories. Outposts taken, equipment destroyed, prisoners captured. The partisans respected his willingness to lead from the front. The Germans responded by strengthening their garrisons, increasing patrols, and tightening security. The battle on Brac and the costs of leadership. In May 1944, an operation was launched to seize an island that controlled shipping lanes along the Dalmatian coast. The landing on Brac took place the night of May 2, 1944. The beach went unopposed. German forces had withdrawn inland and consolidated on the high ground. Churchill arrived with men from No. 43 Commando, a troop from No. 40 Commando, and roughly 1,500 Yugoslav partisans. The makeup of the force, professional commandos and irregular partisans, offered both strength and risk. Coordination across cultural and language divides would determine the assault's outcome. Under the cloak of darkness they waited. The partisans, seeing the strength of German fortifications, delayed the assault until morning. The delay destroyed tactical surprise. Without speed, entrenched defenses become insurmountable. Churchill was furious, but fury could not force obedience from allies with different risk thresholds. The next morning, the assault began. No. 43 launched a flanking maneuver. No. 40 under Churchill mounted a direct attack. The partisans remained behind the beaches. The Germans were ready. Machine gun fire slashed the approaches. Mortars crashed into the formation. Churchill pressed upward, bagpipes slung, sword at his side, urging men to follow. The slope was a world of iron. A mortar salvo found Churchill's position. The explosive lethality killed and wounded many at once. By a brutal twist of fortune, every man in the immediate circle died or was incapacitated. All but Churchill, who had been standing slightly apart playing his pipes, encouraging his men forward. The image is almost too cinematic to believe. A hillside littered with corpses, a bagpiper alive in the middle like a man pulled out of legend. Ammunition exhausted, alone, surrounded. Escape impossible. Churchill did what he had done before. He sat on a rock, pulled his bagpipes to his lips, and played a lament. "Will ye no come back again?" The Germans approached slowly. The spectacle of a single British officer seated among dead men playing a lament disarmed their reflexes. They were too shocked to shoot. A grenade exploded nearby, knocking Churchill out. When he awoke, he was a prisoner. Capture, Sachsenhausen, and the indomitable spirit. He was transported to Berlin for interrogation. Those who handled him were at first intrigued, then embarrassed. They had imagined, like many of us, that a Churchill might relate to Winston. They were correct in one sense. The name carried weight. But this Churchill had no strategic insight to trade with Mars and no maps that predicted campaigns. He gave them none of the secrets they hoped for. He loved his sword and his pipes and nothing else. Sachsenhausen concentration camp in northern Germany became the place the Nazis used for political prisoners, resistance figures, people the regime feared might be of value or simply dangerous to its narrative. Churchill was placed in a special compound with other notable prisoners. The camp's brutality was systematic. Most prisoners did not leave. Inside this machinery of despair, Churchill refused to accept defeat. He observed guard routines, studied the fence lines, found weaknesses in the perimeter. With a few trusted partners, he began to dig. They used spoons and bits of metal, slow, dangerous work, hauling dirt into compost piles and dispersing it to avoid detection. The tunnel they dug extended over 100 meters. On September 23, 1944, Churchill and 4 other British officers crawled through the tunnel and emerged into a waiting night. They split and fled into the German countryside. Churchill paired with squadron leader Bertram James, a survivor of the Great Escape from Stalag Luft III. Their plan: walk north to the Baltic and find a boat to neutral Sweden. For more than a fortnight, they traveled by night and hid by day, living on stolen vegetables, drinking from streams, avoiding towns. Eventually, luck ran out. Near the town of Rostock, they were spotted. Captured, they were returned to captivity. But the war's collapse had begun, and conditions shifted unpredictably. Churchill was transferred to a camp in Austria, deep in the Alps. Nevertheless, his indomitable will continued to assert itself. In late April 1945, as Germany crumpled, a transfer of prominent prisoners put him in a position of temporary opportunity. The SS intended to use them as bargaining chips or murder them in a last vindictive act. Instead, Wehrmacht officers intervened in many cases, and in one chaotic moment the SS withdrew. The prisoners were abandoned in a small Italian village, alive but stranded. Churchill's response to opportunity was characteristic. He began to walk toward Allied lines. He walked 150 kilometers through the mountains with an injured ankle and no supplies. After 8 days, he stumbled upon an American reconnaissance unit near Verona. The Americans listened as a ragged, unidentifiable British officer talked of bagpipes, swords, and the prisoners he had once led. They accepted him because of the force of his presence and the peculiar coherence of his story. Back in Britain in May 1945, the war in Europe ended. Concentration camps were being liberated. Cities were in ruin. For Churchill, however, Europe's surrender was not an end but a prelude. He requested service in the Far East. He wanted to carry his sword into one more battle, to play bagpipes on one more beach. He wanted to test the same tactics in a different fight. His deployment east was underway when the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima, August 6, 1945, and Nagasaki, August 9, 1945. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. Churchill's reaction, repeated with a private, rueful bluntness among those who served with him, was that without the American bombs, the war might have dragged on another decade. It was a dark, uncomfortable joke and an accurate expression of a man who had found himself most alive in combat. Post-war, the strange transition. The British Army never had a comfortable place for the man who loved the chaos of war. Peace required paperwork, compromise, and political patience, things Churchill had little time for. He was too aggressive for peacetime garrisons, too eccentric for staff appointments, too famous to ignore. He accepted roles in training and instruction because they allowed him to pass the ethos of the Commandos and the hard disciplines of small unit tactics to new soldiers. He served in Burma during the transition from war to peace as a staff officer. He found the routine tedious. He sought assignments where he could be near the action or shaping it. He qualified as a parachutist in his 40s, leaping from aircraft to prove to himself and to others that he still belonged to the storm. By 1946, the world had shifted into new conflicts: decolonization, independence movements, and the reshuffling of empires. In 1947, Churchill was transferred to Palestine as second in command of the 1st Battalion Highland Light Infantry, a volatile posting as Jewish refugees and Arab residents clashed in the dying days of the British Mandate. On April 13, 1948, A convoy carrying medical staff to Hadassah Hospital was ambushed and 77 people were killed. Churchill was involved in the evacuation of trapped staff on Mount Scopus. He personally oversaw the movement of 700 doctors, students and patients to safety, working with British military units, Jewish authorities, and Arab leaders. His method, he said later, was simple. People are less likely to shoot someone who smiles. For Churchill's psychology, that old instrument he had wielded at the head of charges and in the quiet of an ambush was again the decisive tool. After Palestine, he returned to Britain. The army offered training assignments and staff roles. He accepted them without zeal. He trained new commandos, passing on the hard lessons he had learned on frozen beaches and mountain ridgelines. He continued to jump out of airplanes in his 40s. War had given him a restless appetite for risk. Peacetime never quite satisfied it. Another life, the quirky retirement. Jack Churchill's retirement in 1959 with the rank of lieutenant colonel was not quiet. He had served more than 30 years. He had fought in Europe in its greatest war and in several lesser conflicts. He had escaped prison, captured dozens of enemy soldiers, and walked through hell and back. He earned a Distinguished Service Order with bar, a Military Cross with bar, and several mentions in dispatches. In civilian life, he remained odd and magnetic. He repaired steamboats and sailed them on the Thames. He built radio-controlled model warships and sailed them on local ponds. He still played his bagpipes at regimental functions. Where others downsized the drama of their lives, he curated it. His daily commute became an anecdote. He would throw his briefcase out the train window at precisely the right location so that it landed in his garden at home. He had calculated the distance and practiced the paradox until it became routine. He married and fathered a son, Malcolm, who remembered an evening when his father would tell stories over a quiet glass of wine. Frank, precise, devoid of boast. He did not aggrandize himself. He told of days when men died and of the business of leadership. He said little of glory. He spoke more often of duty and the men who did it. In July 1955, at age 48, he stood on the banks of the River Severn at Gloucestershire with a homemade surfboard and attempted something else odd. River surfing the tidal bore of the Severn. Local fishermen thought him mad. He rowed the bore upstream for over a mile, becoming one of Britain's first surfers. It was the kind of unnecessary danger that had defined a life. He had to be on the edge. He had to feel the motion that reminded him he was alive. Legacy: how a living legend ends. He died on March 8, 1996, aged 89, at Surrey in England. He had outlived many of his comrades and most of the men he had led. He died peacefully, surrounded by his family, in a world that had largely moved beyond the modes of war he had lived in. Guided missiles and nuclear arsenals made the old chestnuts sound quaint. Swords, bows, and pipes were the costume of an earlier theater. Yet those artifacts obscure a deeper truth. Jack Churchill's war mattered not because he was eccentric, but because he used psychology to amplify force. He understood, with the clarity of a practitioner of old and new arts, that warfare is more than munitions and supply lines. It is the compression of human will into moments. That compression can be shaped by sound, by suddenness, by the uncompromising posture of a man who will not yield. He never called himself a hero. He never wanted the pedestal. He was proud of his unit, modest about his luck, and honest about the men who died alongside him. In private, he expressed regrets for the cost of victory and a painful awareness of the permanent marks war leaves on the living. Obituaries tried to distill him into an idea. One British paper wrote that if Churchill had not existed, it would have been impossible to invent him. And in that hyperbole lies something close to truth. His life reads like fiction because it compresses the extremes of a century into one man. But the reality is stranger and purer. He existed and he did those things. Reflection: the lesson, if there is a lesson in a man who shot arrows in 1940 and surfed tidal bores in 1955, it is this. Adaptability, courage, and the refusal to be constrained by conventional thinking matter more than any single tool. Weapons change. Doctrine evolves. But the human variable persists. Jack Churchill weaponized that variable. He converted surprise and myth into force and turned oddness into advantage. War is monstrous and complicated, and men like Churchill do not redeem it. They inhabit it and carve meaning from it. They are instruments of both tragedy and stubborn survival. The story does not ask you to romanticize combat. It asks you to see how one man, with a longbow and a claymore and a set of bagpipes, moved the hearts and minds of others and pressed an edge into the hard flesh of history. History remembers battles and treaties. Real history remembers the men who moved in between them, the quiet leaders, the madmen who were not mad in the crucial way, the officers who understood the soul of combat. Jack Churchill is not merely a curiosity to be laughed at in a museum gallery. He is a figure who shows how improvisation, courage, and a keen understanding of human psychology can alter events. He is a man who refused to trade identity for acceptance and who served in a way the world did not expect. If his story compels you, share it. Tell it to others. We owe the men who went to war the simplest courtesy, to remember honestly, without myth-making but without cheap diminishing. Because memory is the last, fragile defense we possess against the deadliest of repeats. This has been an Eagle War Stories presentation. Thank you for listening. If you learned something new, hit like so others can find the story. Subscribe for more untold tales of courage and unlikely legend. Until next time, keep their names with you.